Well, hello everyone and welcome. Welcome to Designing Medical Devices to be Intuitive. So this is actually the first in Flex's webinars. It's a series that covers a variety of topics related to medical device design and development. So thank you so much for being part of this premier audience, and we hope you find it informative. Today, Kate MacNamee is going to share her thoughts on how to design devices that minimize human error. He is a senior human factors engineer with us at Farm, which is a Flex company. He's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we are happy to answer your questions. So please do use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the screen at any time. And then we'll spend the last 10 minutes of our 30 minutes webinar answering your questions. So take it away, Kate.
Thanks, Patty. So thank you all for being here today. It's sort of an informal, fun talk. It's not always that we get the opportunity to speak with so many clients, and so really appreciate the turnout as well. So today, as Patty mentioned, we're going to be talking about making medical devices intuitive. But the way that I'd like to do that is by first starting to explain what we mean by intuitive. It's sort of become this buzzword, and human-centered design and human factors have become a catch-all. And so specifically what I want to talk about today is attention. Now, attention is a cognitive control, and so it's our ability to focus on some things and ignore others. And so what I want to do today, to avoid too much scientific jargon, is to talk to you about what attention actually is, why it matters in medical devices specifically, and then what we can do to make devices that are sort of friendly with the way that the brain works when it comes to attention. So the way I want to talk about it today is that attention is a lot like money in that it's a finite resource. It's an executive function in the brain, attention is, that is. And it's really that the idea, we talk about it in terms of money all the time, that we're paying attention, right? So paying attention is the act of choosing where to allocate cognitive resources. So it's sort of this resource management within your brain. And we're constantly choosing, as I said, what to focus on, and also at the same time, what to ignore or what to inhibit. So as a finite resource, just like money, the more you spend, the less you have. And in the case of this sort of abstract concept of attention, what we're really talking about are glucose molecules. So dollars, glucose, same thing. You spend it, you have less, and you need to replenish it once you've spent a good amount doing a complex task or demanding sort of an attention-demanding activity. So why do we care about the fact that attention is finite? And the reason is that as we get low on attention, which is getting low on glucose ultimately, low attentional resources means compromises in performance. So our brain is constantly trying to conserve resources because of this. So as we get low, let's say we have a couple of complex planning tasks, and then you have an emotional meeting, and basically, your brain's already low on these resources, so now it's going to try to conserve it. And what conservation does is it means that you start to rely on things that are easier, like general rules or rules of thumb and heuristics. And those might be applicable for a high majority of opportunities or a high majority of situations, but not all. And those few that aren't necessarily going to agree with the general rule, that's when things like errors happen. And this is also problematic because we can't just snap our fingers and say, all right, more attention, it's time for more cognitive resources. The problem with this is that replenishing resources really does take time. And that means sleep, it could be food, it could be a walk in the woods, detaching from your cell phone, things like that. But without restoration, we stay drained, and our ability to interpret nuance or do complex tasks without errors really decreases. Now, resources can fluctuate within an individual. So lack of sleep, not skipping breakfast or not having enough food, doing a complex task like maybe planning your calendar for the next couple of months or prioritizing cases. Those types of things will make your resources dwindle, and then as you maybe eat or sleep or take a break, then those resources can replenish. But they also are different across individuals. So I might have maybe a lower threshold for attentional drain than somebody else. This doesn't correlate with intelligence by any means, but what we have to acknowledge is that we want to be thinking about the worst case scenario, if you will, as far as attentional resources. So someone who already doesn't have much attention to pay, even at their best, could be very quickly and easily drained after only one or two major tasks. So the good news, however, is that not everything requires attention. If it did, we'd be going through the day kind of like zombies, drained, completely, non-functional or borderline functional after only a couple of hours in the morning. Controlled thought is what we consider things that require, substantial resources like attention, bottom-up processing, so actively looking at and interpreting the world around us, executive functions such as planning, prioritizing, and then working memory. So all these things are the things that will ask attention of us, and as well as emotional regulation is a big one as well. But then you have things like automatic thought. They require very little resources. They're reflexive behaviors, breathing, walking, learned coordinations. It can be things like habits. So maybe checking your inbox every day. The way that you navigate in, let's say, Outlook or Gmail is something that's very automatic to you at this point. You don't really have to think too much about it. But the first time you encounter that particular interface, I'm sure that you actually had to use a good deal of resources to figure out where everything was. So all of this information, that attention is a finite resource, that the resource needs to be replenished when spent, and that when spent or when low, we're making lots of different errors, or it can sort of decrease task, leads to how it applies to the medical field. Now, in the medical field, there are different types of demands, different levels of attention that are required to be paid in different environments. For instance, let's say there's a diabetic patient at home and they're a single parent, they have kids, maybe pets sort of running around, making lots of noise or playing. They might get interruptions from FedEx or Amazon, and they could also maybe be emotionally regulating, not only to try and keep patient while their kids or dogs or whatever are doing all these things, but also maybe a fear of needles, so trying to calm themselves down amidst all of this. In a situation like that, their resources are going to be spent on all these other things, and they may not have enough resources to dial the correct dose on their insulin pen. And that, as we all know, can lead to very severe errors and possibly have fatal consequences or hospitalization. Now, another diabetic patient with maybe home insulin injection could have a much easier time. It could be quiet. They could live with a partner. Maybe they're an older adult. It could be something where they don't have to stick themselves that many times because they wear a CGM and they've gotten comfortable with it. The needle might have a safety needle on it. So all these things can kind of combine from an environmental and device standpoint to give them lots of resources so that they're very easily able to properly dial their dose. And it decreases the risk of them making a mistake, even if it's, maybe someone like an older adult. You might think, oh, well, cognitively, do they have as many resources? In an environment like this, they're actually poised to do better than, say, a younger parent with all of these noises and distractions and tasks on which to allocate their resources. Now, clinically, you have the similar situations, right? So there's emergency surgical suites. Any emergent procedure is high pressure. It's very time sensitive often. There's a lot of scrutiny from regulatory bodies because of malpractice, fast, nuanced team communication. So they're talking to nurses and techs and other physicians, and there's a lot of unpredictability. There's patient volumes that are kind of coming in waves, and there could be substantial emotional regulation dealing with patients, their families, as well as maybe their other clinical team members. And on the opposite side of the coin, you have something maybe like a dermatology office where there's not a lot of emotional regulation, very few emergent procedures. You probably have things like sufficient staff. You can probably take your lunch hour at a regular time every day and not worry about it. Everything, obviously there's some stress, it's medical still, but it's definitely a lot more manageable, and you're probably making a lot fewer mistakes than, say, somebody in an emergent procedure. So really thinking about the devices that are going to be used and the worst case scenario in which they could be used. So yes, it may be that your device is used in both a dermatology office and a hospital setting, but designing it for the hospital setting to make sure that it can be resilient in the face of errors is key. And so what this means for us is we talk about automatic thoughts as beneficial, right? So in one sense, it saves us. It helps us conserve all these resources, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But on the other hand, automaticity can lead to these errors. And when we lean on them, applying that general rule to a specific situation, or relying on a prior experience and sort of reacting rather than being proactive, we see these errors. So the question becomes, is automaticity something that we should be discouraging? And that's sort of how most human factors and historically a lot of device design has gone. It's, well, let's demand more attention. Let's make sure that we avoid these inappropriate automaticity. Let's demand that people exert cognitive control when using our device. That's flashing LEDs, that's alarms. But we've learned that alarm fatigue is a very real thing, and that demanding more attention, really, when you think about what we've been talking about for the last 10 or 15 minutes, it's just draining and it's just asking for more resources. And it can be really tempting to say, well, that's safer. We should be asking a lot of these people, but automatic thought is inevitable. And the biggest thing that we can do as device designers and device developers is to ensure that our devices are resilient to automatic thought and allow participants or users to go on autopilot, to make sure that when they do go on autopilot, they can do so safely. So if you can't prevent automaticity, the goal is really to facilitate it. And what I'll start with is I'll give you guys some process tips as far as what I think are some of the best ways to begin thinking from a high level, the process to make sure that we can identify, well, what even are the automatic thoughts of our users? And then I'll delve into some more specific examples of what those devices could look like and why that matters. So first and foremost, this is the shameless human factors plug, but researching early and often. I'm talking not just human factors from a formative and summative perspective, but also generative, strategic design research. We're talking about getting in on the environment, being in the fields, talking to real users, and really understanding and designing your research in a way that allows you to collect data that will then help you understand your users' cognitive patterns. And those patterns will be different from interventional radiologists to dermatologists to general surgeons to nurses to technologists. They all have different priorities and maybe different ways in which they find themselves defaulting to automatic processes. So then once you have these data, you've done your research and you have data that suggests, okay, these are the mental models, the defaults, and the automatic tendencies of our users. What do? And you design to support safe automatic thought. So if okay, well, in 9 out of 10 EMRs, the delete button is in the upper right-hand corner, and that's where they go to delete everything. Maybe it's best to put things in the upper right-hand corner, but still allow yourself to innovate. Maybe the way in which the icon is depicted, or making sure that you can only hit delete button in that upper right-hand corner when it makes contextual sense. So finding a little bit more nuance in that design. And then once you have a design set that's based on facilitating automatic thought, you can go ahead and confirm it, because no matter how strategic you were in your design and how concrete your theories are, you always want to test it, because there can be certain holes, and you can always find small ways to tweak it to make it better. So you want to make sure that you confirm mitigations with representative users and say, okay, we've gotten this device that's really well informed and really sleek, and we want to make sure that in a stressed out situation or with low resources, that these folks can use it appropriately. Now, in each of these 3 steps, it's extremely important to use this sort of 4th panel that I have over on the right, which is collaborating as much as possible. And I know that sounds a little bit, vague and kind of an obvious thing to say, but when you think about research, oftentimes people just get the report, especially internally, large companies, big OEMs. It's really easy to say, okay, well, research is going to go do their thing, and then they're going to provide the documentation. But I've found that early research especially is far more successful when you get everybody's buy-in early. It's, I'm talking marketing, engineering, design, C-suite, everybody should be aligned very, very early on as to the research and why it's being done the way it's being done. So that when the results come out, not only are people not necessarily surprised, but they also had a part in the types of questions that were being asked, and they understand the questions being asked are very pointed to understand, not only just what's happening in the environment and what are the demands, but how are people thinking about this device, and how can we make sure we're matching that or allowing them, preventing them really from doing things that they shouldn't. And from an example standpoint, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach low demand or sort of like automatic friendly design. And I call it low demand design because it's design that asks less of the user as a means to facilitate safety and success. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I just pulled a few kind of salient, quick and easy examples to give you some concrete ideas of what this sort of thing could look like. So first is just color coding. Simplifying the setup process, especially for things like fluidics carts, when there's a lot of different connections to be made or adapters to be added, there's a lot of demand on the user to do things like tracing lines or figuring out, is this the 3-prong tool or the 4-prong tool? So if you can just get people to go red, okay, where's the red connection? Right there, plug it in, no problem. Okay, where's the yellow connection? Obviously, there are colorblind individuals. So if, for instance, people are red-green colorblind, you want to make sure that you avoid using both red and green, either very close together or in the same space. Or if you do have to use both colors, you could choose maybe very widely disparate physical appearances. So maybe like a 20-prong green adapter and a 2-prong red, so that there's little question or less question as to how those connections might be made. And what that does is it saves time and efficiency and therefore resources in the setup. People aren't frustrated, they're not concerned. If they're moving quickly, they're not trying to exert lots of resources, just doing it right and just getting it to the point where it can be used. So then they have a lot more resources to use it appropriately or to make better decisions diagnostically during any procedure in which the device might be used. Moving to the middle panel here, this idea of visual tools. When we think visual tools, a lot of times we think more iconography or UI, graphical user interfaces. But in this case, I think that physical affordance is and sort of transparent communication from a device can be very minimal and be exceedingly effective. So the idea with this is a temperature sensitive pill pack or medication pack. And what you have are two things that the user needs to worry about. One, can I use it? Is it okay to use? And two, how do I get to it? So you have, a simple sort of thermometer type, sensor on the top. The device very clearly states you're all set, it's good to use. It doesn't make you spend time interpreting or looking for, a small, poorly printed expiration date somewhere in the corner, which could be on the back. You can still have all the regulatory necessary information, elsewhere on the packaging. But this, if you're an experienced user, you've been, take this medication once a day or once a week, you grab the pack out of the fridge, it says good to use, you pull the tab and you've accessed it. So you're minimizing the amount of effort and information required to sift through in order to get to the goal and achieve, something that might be either less pleasant or hard to remember, and really removing that burden from the user. And then lastly, sort of this idea of like smart sensing. I think that connected health is something that is becoming increasingly popular in the industry, and for good reason, but I think that it can also overwhelm. And there are lots of ways in which you can give people, a smart device that's actually sort of demanding and requires them to think a lot more about various information, or presents them with confusing information rather than distilling things down and keeping it simple. So if you're going to create a connected device, the goal is to have every element within that device remove burden from the user rather than demanding that they try to do more with it or input more information. For instance, in this case, this is a scoliosis brace intended to be used predominantly with young adults with scoliosis. So the first screen you see at the bottom here, it says, oh, brace is off. And so it's letting either the parent or the child know either your brace is too loose and I think it's off, or it's telling the parent, hey, your child isn't being compliant, even though they're supposed to be. Maybe they took it off at school to have fun, so if you check and you think that it's not a time they should be having it off, then that's a good way of just reminding them why they're doing it. It allows you to not worry about, I wonder if they're keeping the brace on. Now you know. In the middle section down here, the middle picture on the right, this is actually a tracking tool that would explain, okay, you've been wearing it for 7 out of the 16 hours that you're supposed to be wearing it today. And so it shows some progress. You don't have to do the math. It shows a little gap where maybe you took it off, to ride the bus or for gym class or something like that. And, it allows you to say, okay, well, I'm still making progress. I'm doing what I should be doing. and you don't have to worry about logging and tracking and things like that. And then just the idea that you can, send push notifications of you have 2 more hours to go or just 1 hour left. So this idea of sort of motivational or gamification of devices, but also still asking the user to think less about it and just encouraging them emotionally as well. So things like this are only a few of myriad ways that we can address medical errors and attentional related medical errors with more resilient devices. And this idea of making sure you put in the research and put in the work to ultimately elevate design through thoughtful and nuanced research is something that we're really passionate about at Farm and Flex, and it's something that we hope to really continue sharing throughout the industry and see happening a lot more often. And with that, I'll send it back to Patty.
Thanks, Kate. Those are really good examples. And I see that we actually got some questions that have arisen from it. So I'm going to go and ask those for you. So one is,
excellent.
All right, so what do you do when the users ask for something that actually increases the number of things that they have to think about? How do you balance user needs and design principles?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that we get a lot from our clients, frankly, because oftentimes you'll see, we'll go in and do the research, and we'll come out with a recommendation that says one thing, and someone will say, well, but participant number 3 said that they wanted, to have a pop-up window here, and it's important to remember that even though the regulatory agencies put a lot of emphasis on subjective, participant feedback from research studies, that people, it's not important what they want, it's more important why they want it, because they don't necessarily always know the best solution, but they do know their own motivations. And so when someone says, well, I would like a pop-up window here, or I'd like, an alarm, then the question is, well, why do you want that alarm? And they might say, well, I don't usually notice the alarm, and this is a really important step. And so then it's the designer and researcher and engineer's job to come back together and say, okay, well, how can we solve that problem of this error not being paid attention to, or this error popping up without being noticed, without necessarily demanding people's attention? Is this something where the device could have a screen that's remote that sort of pops up with a more obvious warning? It could be something where the hand tool that you're working with, rather than having to look back at the screen, there's something on the hand tool itself. And so rather than making those off-the-cuff answers of participants the ultimate mitigation, you can think of more creative and sort of nuanced mitigations that would allow you to meet the why need as opposed to the what.
All right, now here's another one. So how do you convince a purchaser in a hospital or a clinic that something that allows for automatic thought is actually safer than something that has lots of bells and whistles and alarms?
Right. No, this is great, because there is a lot of scientific literature out there that would suggest that automatic thought is inevitable, but there's a lot of pressure, I think, on folks who want to make sure that they have some evidence of safety. And if there's 12 alarm features, it can feel like safety, but in a lot of ways it's more the illusion of safety and more of a halo bias, in my opinion. So the best thing to do is to, as you test and document your use errors, you could also do benchmarking studies with your competitors' devices and show differences in errors or equivalent error rates if they're both quite low or zero. So I think it's still data driven, but that carefully designed research that you do, from the very beginning, can often, if you do it right, lead to excellent data to show purchasers and maybe convince or further support the idea that this device is going to be exceedingly safe when the hospital adopts it.
All right, this looks like the last question. How does this relate to design unification across brands? Is the type of design thinking that you talk about part of that?
Yeah, so for a little bit of background, design unification across brands is something that for the last probably 20 years, safety advocates have been pushing for. So the idea that, let's say, big players in the hospital setting, so like Philips and GE and Siemens, would all have the same interfaces on their devices. I think this is a little bit different than that. low demand design is something that's almost an alternative to sort of that unification across brands or universal branding or universal UI design across brands. And I think that it would be, the answer really is that we don't know whether, low demand design is as effective as, a universal interface design. But I do think that it would be really compelling to do some research and compare the error rates between, well-designed and thoughtfully designed medical devices and, medical devices that all have a similar interface, and see if there are substantial differences in errors. But this could definitely be something that could supplement or be a substitute for that type of maybe less business-friendly but safety-friendly approach.
All right, thank you so much for that, Kate. It looks like there's no more questions. But for those of you who have attended this, we're going to send you a link to this recording, and you will also get an article that Kate wrote that appeared in BI and T magazine. So it's called A Neurocognitive Approach to Developing Safer Medical Devices. And I think you'll find that really helpful and informative as well. And as you can see here, she's got her email listed, so feel free to contact Kate. And if you were interested in future talks, we're going to have actually 2 series. So one is on medical device development and design, and then the other track is on medical manufacturing and supply chain. So if you're interested in that calendar and you want to get on the calendar and get those invitations automatically, do email us at healthsolutions@flex.com, and we will be happy to send you those invites. Thanks so much for your attention, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.